no one seemed to notice, but something critical was missing. One fundamental question that all of us would ask when thinking about any big idea that would take huge effort and hard work to accomplish. The missing question and the troubling answer is what this documentary is all about.
The Pacific Northwest is justifiably famous for its spectacularly beautiful scenery and natural beauty. It is a very special place. From high snow-covered volcanoes to wild coastlines, from mighty rivers and dense evergreen rainforests to dry deserts and shimmering lakes, the 170,000 square miles of Washington and Oregon have it all. Millions of salmon and other wild animals, plus a vast array of birds, join a parade of aquatic creatures that call this area their home.
About 12,000 years ago, new inhabitants appeared. People. At the end of the last ice age, when glaciers thousands of feet thick still covered Seattle and the Puget Sound, people from Asia started to settle in this region. Before the continental glaciers melted and raised sea level by over 300 feet, those first people may have walked across the Bering Strait on dry land. Thousands of years later, Europeans discovered this area. Lewis and Clark were here barely 200 years ago. Therefore, cities like Seattle, Portland, Spokane, Walla Walla, Medford, Vancouver, and Eugene were founded as the Oregon Trail, and railroads drew thousands of settlers westward towards a vision of beauty, adventure, and opportunity. But pioneer life was not easy. Clearing trees with an axe is hard work. Plowing and harvesting with horses, barely less so. Household chores were backbreaking. Things we take for granted today, like running water and refrigerators, were basically unavailable.
Eventually, the Industrial Revolution made it out west, and that revolution was built on using energy to do mechanical work. The last 100 years has seen an historic transformation that earlier generations would find miraculous. And the key has been twofold: abundant, affordable energy, especially electricity, and human creativity. In the 1930s, the Columbia River system began to be harnessed in a massive way to produce cheap electric power.
As I look on Bonneville Dam today, which will give us more wealth, better living, and greater happiness for our children.
Eventually, nuclear power also made its appearance. All the while, people found more and more ways to use energy to create prosperity, resulting in better and longer lives.
I love the Pacific Northwest. I was born in Portland and have lived in Oregon and Washington ever since. We now have 12 million people living here who enjoy the great outdoors. They live and work here, raising families. They want to enjoy life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This means industry, agriculture, services, art, telecommunications, software, and distribution. It means housing, heating, cooling, and transportation. All of that requires affordable, reliable, and abundant energy.
Something the Pacific Northwest has had for decades and we now take for granted. Electric generating resources are dominated by hydropower, but also include coal, natural gas, nuclear, solar, and wind.
It's taken 135 years to build the vast electric network that we enjoy today without thinking about it. But electricity has a unique characteristic most of us have never thought about.
Energy is the only commodity that has to be consumed the instant it's generated. And the grid, as you can see, has to always be in balance.
But politicians may not have fully understood the importance of this fact as they considered new mandates for the electric utility industry.
In 2019, the Washington legislature passed and the governor signed SB 5116. The new law mandated that the state's electricity supply would be 100% carbon neutral by 2030 and 100% carbon free by 2045. The law also required that the last coal-fired electric generation plant be taken out of service in 2025. Not to be outdone, in 2021, Oregon enacted an even more aggressive mandate, HB 2021, requiring electric utilities be carbon-free by 2040. Subsequently, Oregon's only coal-fired power plant was demolished in 2022.
Why were these unprecedented laws passed in the Pacific Northwest? We don't have to guess. SB 5116 itself states in Section 1, quote, "The legislature finds that Washington must address the impacts of climate change by leading the transition to a clean energy economy. Climate change poses immediate, significant threats to our economy, health, safety, and national security," unquote. Politicians themselves explained why they supported these laws.
We've moved forward on a number of bills and taken action to tackle climate change. I signed into law a couple weeks ago the most aggressive clean energy bill in the country.
Governor Inslee even decided to run for president, using SB 5116 as a major reason for his campaign.
I'm the only candidate with experience bringing 100% clean energy to our state, building a $6 billion wind industry.
You have to understand, this is a climate crisis, and it is our last chance to do something about it.
House Bill 2021 will help us understand how to really help our vulnerable communities become resilient. And in addressing energy mix, it will help us mitigate the climate tumult that is driving conditions on the ground.
So we know why the laws were passed, and it certainly sounds exciting and worthwhile. Given that more than 50% of Pacific Northwest electricity is already from renewable or non-CO2 emitting resources, it may have seemed like a relatively easy and painless directive. No one seemed to notice, but something critical was missing. One fundamental question that all of us would ask when thinking about any big idea that would take huge effort and hard work to accomplish. The missing question and the troubling answer is what this documentary is all about.
So do you see a future in the Northwest with zero carbon?
Yes, absolutely. If we can't do it here in the Northwest with this clean hydro resource that we have, it's unlikely we will be able to do it anywhere in this country.
Let's look at the historical context leading up to passage of these laws. In late 2016, Washington's Governor Inslee commissioned a report from Evolved Energy Research to evaluate scenarios which would achieve 80% reductions in energy-related CO2 emissions in Washington state by 2050. In 2014 dollars, the study projected that the average household would actually save $7 per month on their electricity bill. It concluded, decarbonizing Washington's energy system commensurate with an economy-wide goal of 80% greenhouse gas reductions by 2050 can be achieved at a reasonable cost. That sounds almost too good to be true. We can solve the existential climate crisis and lower costs. Who could complain? The actual law that passed in 2019, however, required net zero carbon by 2030 and 100% carbon-free by 2045, not 80% by 2050, while supporting the electrification of transportation as well as heating and cooling.
In September 2018, Climate Solutions, a Northwest-based clean energy economy nonprofit, released their research done in collaboration with Energy and Environmental Economics, entitled Within Reach: The Path to 100% Fossil-Free Electricity in the Pacific Northwest. The executive summary stated, "The new research confirms that phasing out fossil fuels while phasing in non-fossil sources of energy can provide clean, reliable, affordable power." Unlike the 2016 study, however, the Climate Solutions report concluded that electricity costs would rise by about half a penny per kilowatt hour spread across the entire load of Washington and Oregon.
Okay, maybe that's not as positive as Governor Inslee's earlier report that we would save money, but half a penny more per kilowatt hour still seems like a bargain to avert climate suicide.
In early 2019, an article authored by Audubon, Washington, with contributions from the Sierra Club, Northwest Energy Coalition, and Climate Solutions came out in support of SB 5116. The article said that clean energy resources like wind and solar have become cheaper than coal power and are now cost competitive with natural gas. Moreover, they stated that a transition to 100% clean energy is achievable, affordable, and reliable.
At the same time, the Public Generating Pool, a consortium of 10 customer-owned utilities, plus 3 large investor-owned electric utilities, also hired Energy and Environmental Economics to evaluate other scenarios. This time they looked at the greater northwest of Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Utah, and western Montana and Wyoming. The study did not assume the full electrification of automobiles or buildings, nor did it take into account significant expansion of data centers. One of the main authors had a sobering message.
But you would have to oversize the system by so much that it becomes impractical. So we think it's really not possible with wind, solar, and batteries to serve load reliably throughout the year.
It specifically noted, quote, "Removing final 1% of carbon requires additional $100 billion to $170 billion of investment in 2016 dollars. Consequently, the report concluded that the marginal cost of absolute 100 greenhouse gas reductions vastly exceeds societal cost of carbon, confirming conclusion on impracticality.
To get all the way to zero carbon with today's technologies, we estimate that would double your electric rates. So this is the scenario where you're massively overbuilding the wind and solar resources, and there's windmills on every mountain and solar panels on every corner, because that's really what it would take with today's technologies.
In mid-2019, Governor Inslee signed SB 5116 into law, which set 2030 for reaching net zero and 2045 to reach absolute zero. It is now known as the Clean Energy Transformation Act. There was little serious discussion or further quantification of the cost of complying with the law or the impact on costs of bringing forward the mandate deadlines to 2030 and 2045. As we have seen, Oregon seemed determined to not let Washington hog the spotlight. In 2021, Oregon made a law moving their absolute zero deadline to 2040, but optimistic reports just kept coming.
In June 2021, the Clean Energy Transition Institute in Seattle issued a report entitled Net Zero Northwest. It did not detail costs.
During the 2016 to 2022 time period, as these laws were being considered and adopted, we can see that a variety of scenarios were analyzed and conceptual costs were presented that ranged from saving money to being a small increase in rates to an indication that 100% clean energy could be quite expensive and impractical. As they were moving the goalposts from 2050 to 2045, then 2040, and finally 2030, what did supporters say about costs as the new laws actually came into effect?
So excited to tell you today that the Washington State Senate has passed 100% clean energy renewable bill that just is transformational regarding our electricity system and so much more.
Very excited to have this bill on the way to the governor's desk.
Washington State is leading in the effort to defeat climate change. That's what we're doing today because we are determined to build a solar and wind and electrical system where people can access to get clean energy and cleaner air to breathe for our kids as long as Washington State is here. And so we know that we need to take action. And here's what action looks like. Action looks like a 100% clean electrical grid in the state of Washington.
House Bill 2021, which will move Oregon to 100% clean electricity by 2040. The most ambitious and most aggressive clean energy timeline in the nation, hands down.
They did not talk about costs, but about being bold and leading the nation and defeating climate change. At the start of the research for this documentary, I presumed there must have been reports in the years following passage detailing the costs of complying with the new laws. Finding none, in September 2024, I asked Dr. Glenn Blackman, the Energy Policy Office Manager at the Washington Department of Commerce, if he could point me to any more recent reports. Here was his prompt and appreciated reply. I'm not aware of any studies done after 2019 that separately estimated the cost of CETA, or SB 5116, relative to other policies. In late 2023, as part of its statutory obligation to monitor CETA progress, the Washington Department of Commerce issued its first interim assessment. With respect to financial costs, the report stated it was, quote, premature to assess impacts of 2030 and 2045 standards, unquote. The next department report is not due until 2028. Will it still be premature at that point to know the costs? In September 2024, however, a new report was issued, specifically about the costs of achieving net zero. The Discovery Institute in Seattle, Washington, as part of its Reasonable Energy Project within the Center on Wealth and Poverty, issued a comprehensive report estimating the costs of complying with the Oregon and Washington laws. The report is entitled, The Crippling Cost of Electrification and Net Zero Energy Policies in the Pacific Northwest. Because it is the only report so far that actually details the estimated costs of implementing Oregon's and Washington's net zero laws, we will take a closer look at their 5 steps to calculating what it costs. First, let's meet the 2 authors of the new report.
This is Jonathan Lesser. I'm a senior fellow with the Discovery Institute and a senior fellow with the National Center for Energy Analytics. I work on energy policy research as well as consulting for, regulatory authorities, that sort of thing.
Dr. Lesser is an economist with a BS degree from the University of New Mexico and master's and PhD degrees from the University of Washington.
I'm Mitch Rolling. I'm the Director of Research at Always On Energy Research. I mostly model energy proposals like the ones that you see in this report.
Mitch Rolling has a BA degree from the University of Minnesota and master's degree in finance and economics from Texas A&M University.
There's going to be some data center growth. Basically, from there, we just added increased electricity growth from electric vehicles, electrification of all transportation, as well as electrification of space heating, water heating. The increased data center load will be dwarfed by the increased load from electric vehicles and electrification of space and water.
And what the model does is it looks at what the demand is for all 8,760 hours of the year. It looks at what the existing generators are producing during those years. It also looks at what the wind and solar, what the new wind and solar generation is during those hours. And then whatever that build out can't produce, whatever it can't meet to meet demand, battery storage is the resource that backfills those gaps. And you could build out a lot of capacity for wind and solar, and it's still not going to meet demand because it's intermittent, weather-based, and you have these severe droughts. And so whatever you build, it will inform the battery storage that will come back on the system and fill in those gaps of those droughts.
The authors conclude that by 2050, quote, peak demand would likely double over 2023 peak demand due to full electrification. How does this compare to the Clean Energy Transition Institute's 2021 study?
A full transition to net zero will also come with a massive jump in demand for electricity. Quigley's analysis found that the need for electric power will more than double by 2050.
The report summarizes the amount of solar, wind, and storage capacity needed to meet the model demand in Table 2. As you can see, the nameplate capacity goes up from today's 49,000 megawatts to over 243,000 megawatts. Why such a huge jump?
With reliable fuel-based thermal generators, that's a pretty straightforward question. If you need 1,000 megawatts of capacity, you build 1,000 megawatts of, a coal plant, a natural gas plant, a nuclear plant. But when it comes to wind and solar, it's not so straightforward. If you need 1,000 megawatts of power, just relying on the capacity factor or the production levels of wind and solar, let's take wind, for example, they operate at 30% of their total installed capacity. So you'll need at least, triple to 4 times as much of capacity to meet those generation retirements. But then it's even worse because at times wind and solar may not be generating any electricity at all. You really need to play this out on the system and see when wind and solar are actually producing the energy that you do need. And then when they can't, you need some type of backup energy source like natural gas or battery storage. Because this is a zero carbon dioxide grid, you can't use natural gas. So you need to have the battery storage. And so you need enough wind and solar to keep the lights on and charge the batteries, and the battery kind of backfills those gaps.
In comparison, none of the earlier studies we looked at evaluated Oregon and Washington under the early 100% renewable mandates with full vehicle and building electrification and the recent demand for new data centers. Basically, the earlier studies generally seemed more interested in whether decarbonization was possible and not what it would cost. Before we leave Step 2, let's also take a quick look at the related issue of land use considerations given the immense amount of solar and wind energy generation required for net zero.
If you could co-locate all the wind and solar, in other words, you have wind turbines on the ground and below them are solar panels, you would take about 25% of the entire land area of Eastern Oregon and Eastern Washington. And because that's where the sun shines and because it's more rural. If you didn't co-locate them, it'd take about 30% of the entire land area. And that doesn't include all the land you need for transmission lines going from the eastern portions of the state, those 2 states, through the Cascades.
Table 3 of the report shows the cost assumptions used to construct the necessary wind, solar, and storage capacity, excluding all financing costs. These cost estimates are taken from the January 2024 Energy Information Administration report.
The new report shows that transmission construction costs vary a lot. For their study, they adopted an average cost from the Bonneville Power Administration of $145,000 per megawatt of generating capacity. Recent new transmission lines outside the Pacific Northwest are very expensive. The Champlain Hudson Power Express is a $6 billion project bringing electric energy from Canada to New York City. It is more than 30 times the EPA estimate. The New England Clean Power Link likewise will connect Canada to New England. Its cost for a shorter route is only 10 times the BPA expense. So if anything, the Discovery Report seems on the conservative side. Table 4 shows the total amount of taxes payable through 2050 plus financing costs, both debt and the allowable return on investment for an investor-owned utility. So now we have all the pieces to the puzzle, and we just need to do the math. Remember that a megawatt is 1,000 times more than a kilowatt, so we must compute accordingly. First, we multiply the amount of new capacity needed for solar, wind, and storage by the costs of constructing that capacity. Then, we add the cost of new transmission lines by adding new wind and solar capacity multiplied by the average cost assumed in the new report. This gives us the construction cost of required new generation and transmission capacity. But we also need to recognize that the solar and wind assets that have already been constructed by 2024 must be replaced, because the assets will reach their end of life, which is assumed to be 20 to 25 years, before 2050. So we have to add those replacement costs. Next, the average useful life of storage is only 15 years. This means that all of the storage currently existing or built within the next 10 years will need to be replaced by 2050. To be conservative, let's assume that from now until 2035, we will only build about 15% of the total storage needed, which means we will build 85% between 2035 and 2050. According to the report, we now need to adjust all of these average costs by adding 4% to reflect the cost premium in the Pacific Northwest. This gives us the total construction costs to supply new solar and wind generators, battery storage, and transmission needed by 2050. But now we have to add the costs of operating the assets, including maintenance. Then we can't forget the taxes that must be paid on these assets. And finally, we need to account for the costs of financing, both the interest on debt as well as the regulated return on equity that utilities are entitled to charge on their new assets. Are you ready for the grand total? $1 trillion. But what does $1 trillion mean in the context of Oregon and Washington? For one comparison, let's find out how much it costs Washington State to operate its public school system.
For 16 years, I was the director of education at Washington Policy Center, where I studied very closely the state budget. Well, the total amount that the state is providing for K-12 schools and higher education is $18.6 billion in the current year. So if you just take the $18.5 billion that we spend to educate all the children, K through 12 children, and the 215,000 higher ed students, and divide that number into 1 trillion, it's going to take you 52 years. 52 years of educating over 1 million children in Washington State is what $1 trillion represents.
Wow. Another way to think about it is to divide the total cost by the total number of households in Oregon and Washington. There are about 4.85 million households, which means the cost for each average household is more than $200,000. What does it mean for electric power rates?
For example, in 2050, we estimate that a typical residential homeowner would have an electric bill of $450 per month before taking into account inflation. If you assumed a very modest rate of inflation of 2% per year on average for the next 26 years through 2050, that bill for the typical residential customer would increase to $700 a month.
So it looks like 100% carbon-free electricity is not going to be cheap or easy, unlike what some told us. But hold on a minute. Expensive things, like a diamond ring, can still be worth it, assuming you get the real thing. Remember that the laws were passed to combat and defeat catastrophic climate change. Lawmakers were excited to be bold, so the really important question is, what do we get for our $1 trillion?
The next thing we did was we used an EPA climate model called MAGIC. It's an open source model. Anyone can use it. You can use it online and put in whatever scenario you like. The most recent greenhouse gas inventories for the two states show a total of approximately 100 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent, carbon dioxide equivalent emissions each year. So if you assume you get to net zero and in fact zero carbon emissions, energy-related carbon emissions by 2050, the total reduction in carbon emissions is roughly 1.8 billion metric tons. Now that sounds like a lot, but last year, world energy-related carbon dioxide emissions were over 35 billion metric tons. So basically, between now and 2050, the two states would save the equivalent of a little over 2 weeks of world carbon emissions in 2023. Say you reach zero emissions by 2040, not 2050, but 10 years earlier. The resulting temperature decrease by the year 2100 is less than 3/1000ths of a degree centigrade. A good outdoor thermometer has a sensitivity of about 1/2 of a degree centigrade. The impact on world temperature would be 170 times less than the most accurate outdoor thermometer can measure. Hence, it will have no impact whatsoever on global temperatures or global climate.
No impact whatsoever? We began this documentary extolling the virtues of the Pacific Northwest, my home. We learned about new energy laws in 2019 and 2021 and discovered that compliance is now estimated to cost $1 trillion, a number so huge it is hard to even imagine. Thousands of square miles will be covered with windmills, batteries, solar panels, and high-voltage power lines that we will spend years fighting over permits and construction. Our electric rates will more than double. Everyone will be forced to buy electric cars, and we will have to use electricity for water heating, cooking, plus heating and cooling buildings. We were told the point of all this was to defeat global climate change while maintaining Oregon and Washington as a place of beauty, affordability, and opportunity. But what is the actual result? We don't make any substantive impact on, let alone defeat climate change. We just end up with much more expensive electricity that is inherently unreliable because it is dependent on the wind blowing and the sun shining and precipitation coming, all at just the right times. Energy is the lifeblood of a modern society. Lack of abundant, reliable, and affordable energy is associated with poverty. I know that rich people won't have any trouble paying an extra $100, $200, or $300 a month for their electricity bill. But what about the middle class and the less well-off? How do I explain to my grandson that by the time he is 11, Washington's net zero deadline will be here? And by the time he's 21, Oregon's absolute zero deadline will have passed. By that time, the legislators and governors will be retired on their government pensions. By that time, nearly all the $1 trillion must have already been spent in order to comply with the laws, and my kids and grandson will face something my own generation never had to: poverty-creating electrical prices. What are we doing? How does this make any sense? Can you explain this to your children or your parents?